Thank you everyone so much for sharing your time with John and me today. My name is Emily Shacklett. I'm an advisor here at Fairport and Luma Wealth, and I am happy to be presenting today with my partner in crime and a wonderful offset to my skill sets, John Wirtschafter. John is with McDonald Hopkins Law Firm, and he's got all of the legal and contractual background that you could possibly want as it relates to negotiating your compensation and benefits. I bring a little experience on the financial side, and we're going to talk to you today about a whole well-rounded approach to negotiating your comp. So with that, Annika, I'll tell you to jump to the next slide. So we just talked a little bit about our first jobs and how they might have taken us to where we've ended up on our career trajectory. I heard a lot of common themes around how these jobs have prepared us for future success. And part of what we'll talk about today is how to set yourself up early to be in the best position to end up with, great growth over your life and your assets. But it's never too late to start to make really good decisions. And we've all made mistakes along the way. We've all thought, oh gosh, I wish I would have negotiated that, or asked for a little bit more money, or made a different decision, or oh gosh, maybe I shouldn't have even taken that job to begin with. It just didn't work out well for me. But we're here to tell you that everything you do along your path, it takes you where you're meant to be. And that might mean having some learning experiences that were painful. We'll share with you some of those tips and tricks and pitfalls that we've seen throughout our careers today. So hopefully you can maybe avoid some of those mistakes, but never feel bad about making a decision and pivoting, because that's how we learn. So Annika, if you can take us to the next slide. So today we're going to talk to you about four things. It's really the four steps in a really successful negotiation, whether you are trying to move from a position into a higher position within your current company, whether you're trying to make the move into retirement, for example, and or an encore career, or whether you're looking to change companies, which John and I would both say we're seeing a lot of that these days. And so what steps do you want to take? Number one, build an advisory team. Number two, certainly you want to compare what you have versus what you will get. Three, look at the whole package and not just the monetary features. There's a lot of important non-monetary features that you want to consider. And then four, negotiate an offer that works for you. Next slide, please, Annika. And you can move to the next. So I'd love to keep bothering you folks to put some things in the chats here. So I'm going to ask you another question. And that is, I'd love to hear from you, how many of you have an advisory team? Keep in mind, there's some standard advisory team members we've listed here, the CPAs, the attorneys, wealth advisors, and insurance advisors. And these are all people that play a critical role in helping you to gain the knowledge to make the best decisions around your career. But at the same time, there may be a number of different non-traditional advisors that are important in these types of discussions as well. Executive coaches, life coaches, could be your parents, mentors. If you're in a forum group, your forum cohorts, respected peers, both within your company, outside of your company. These are all the people that can be on your team of advisors that would help you to maybe think a little more objectively, to look at things outside of the box a bit as you make decisions around your comp. Because at the end of the day, this is it's an emotional decision for us, whether we're moving from job to job or going into retirement. It's big change and it can be scary. So to have folks that can help you to take a step back, look at the big picture and be more objective is super critical. Next slide, please, Annika. So now we're going to talk a little bit about comparing what you have versus what you will get. Next slide, please. All right. So why might people take the leap to make a job change or be afraid to take the leap to make a job change? At the end of the day, hopefully things are going really well in your current career and your old position, and you have a lot of security, you have longevity, you know what those benefits are, you have a great reputation. You've really amassed a following of mentor and mentees in your office. So it feels really good to be there, but you may find that you've hit a ceiling, that there's other opportunity out there that you can't find within your current company and you want to make a move. In new position, this opportunity, the ability to advance, if things aren't going as well as I just talked about, the ability for a fresh start, they're all critical. But you definitely want to be weighing these risks and these rewards. Making a change, it's always taking a leap of faith. And so, it's a question of what are you leaping away from and what are you leaping into? Next slide, please.
And Emily, let me just pipe in for a second.
Absolutely.
Because there's a few of these I think that kind of stick out. First of all, almost every study says that the main reason why people quit their job or take another job is because they didn't like their boss or didn't feel appreciated. And obviously that's important, but some of these others are kind of important as well. If your long-term incentives are underwater, that simply means that you're going to have to work extra, especially hard, just to get back to zero. So when you value that long-term incentive, it has little or no value to you. Now, if that's the case, that's probably true for most employees in your company, or a lot of employees in your company. So this is a system problem and not necessarily individual to you. And so, this might be an opportunity to let that be heard among your superiors that, hey, they need to fix this or they're going to have a problem with other people and who knows. So that's something you can do. But I think for the most part, it's the opportunity that, if you don't see an opportunity for advancement, and you don't, see where your path is, then a lot of times that's the time to start thinking outside of your employer. Thanks.
Excellent point, John. Thank you. Thanks so much for sharing. What gives you leverage? I would say definitely having a current job gives you leverage. You, especially if you're feeling good about your current situation, and you don't have to make a move, it gives you the confidence to ask a lot of questions and not have to worry too much because, boy, I can just stay where I'm at right now. But there's other things certainly that give you a lot of leverage in your negotiating process. You may have special skills or unique skill set. I will tell you, in my world, being a CPA, that's a financial advisor and wealth manager, that's a really helpful skill set. It gives me the ability to advise on topics that maybe some other wealth managers do not. So do you have a special expertise or skill set that's really special in your business? Another thing is, and boy, we're probably seeing a lot of this these days, I'm sure John more than anybody, you may have multiple job offers. There's a lot of movement in the market right now. Companies are chomping at the bit to hire people, and having multiple job offers does give you that leverage. John,
and Emily, leverage is just totally a relative concept in the sense that everyone has some leverage. You don't have to take that job. You're not desperate. Or if you are, they don't know that. Everyone has some leverage, and the more leverage you have, the more you can demand, the more you can, come back to your employer or to the employer that's, making you an offer and say, hey, I need to talk to you about the following 3 or 4 or 6 or 12 or 23 items in order to make this an acceptable offer. So I've worked with probably 100 contracts a year, employment contracts a year, either on behalf of employers or on behalf of employees. And everyone's a little bit different as far as the advice I would give someone on just how much to ask for. And it all comes down to leverage. If you are really in demand and you have a skill set that is obvious and needed, then you have the ability to ask for what you want for the most part. And as long as you're reasonable, you're likely to get it. If you're straight out of college and you're entering an entry position or a relatively low position, you don't have nearly as much leverage. And a lot of times it's not necessarily a take it or leave it, but you ought to limit your issues to just a few key things and not go in there and ask for the world. So leverage is a huge factor in deciding, how to respond to an offer. Go ahead.
Excellent. Next slide, and John's going to talk to you a bit about what's in your agreement as we get started here. But now is where John and I will cover both the monetary and the non-monetary factors that you might want to think about as you negotiate. And what better place to start than the complex, what's in your agreement? And John's your man.
Sure. So what's in your agreement? I mean, basically, there are two types of employment. There's an at-will employment, and then there's contractual employment. For the most part, almost everybody is at will. And all that means is that you can be terminated for any reason at any time. You may have a contract that says what happens if in fact you are terminated. You may have severance, you may have other benefits that come to you as a result of that. But very few companies sign contracts that don't ultimately allow them to terminate an employee. It's just, it would be irresponsible to do so. There aren't very few lifetime appointments, unless you're like a federal judge or something like that. And we're not getting into that because we don't negotiate those kinds of contracts. So most of us will be at will. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't have a contract that then sets forth the terms of, you know, what we're going to get paid, how we're going to get paid, what rights we have, what benefits, and so forth. But you will be able to be terminated. So let's move on to the next slide if we can. So these are the tend to be the provisions of an employment contract, and recognize that, you know, there are different forms of employment contracts. There can be an actual legal contract, an employment agreement that has all sorts of provisions, and a lot of companies will have those for, you know, their key executives and maybe for the, you know, the top executives, but they don't tend to have those, you know, below that. What they tend to have below that are offer letters that have the key terms that which you're going to be entitled to. And they may have many of these same provisions in those key terms. And then they're legally binding, assuming that you've accepted the offer letter. You know, that is a legally binding commitment. But the difference between that and a straight contract is that the contract will have very specific terms that are contractually agreed to between you and the company. And the only way to change those is either that the contract allows it to be changed, or you and the company agree to change it. Whereas an offer letter will just basically give you your general terms, which are contractual commitments, but then it'll refer to all sorts of policies on, you know, whether or not you're entitled to severance, what benefits you'll be entitled to, whether or not you participate in the equity or the long-term incentives, and so forth, what your vacation pay might be. Things like that are all done by company policies. And the difference with that is that the company can change their policies pretty much anytime they want on a prospective basis. Those are, you know, we're not going to get into a technical discussion, but those are covered under ERISA. And for the most part, they can be changed by the company unilaterally. So they're not quite as comforting to an executive if you have an agreement that provides you with X, Y, and Z, and it turns out that, well, the company has decided to get rid of X and Y, so now all you have is Z. So we're going to go into the components. I mean, briefly, these are them, non-competes and other restrictive covenants.
And John, we have a question here in the chat that I think is applicable to your current discussion. Renee
Please.
has asked, if an at-will company terminates, how can you be secure about severance? Is there a standard?
So, and that's a great question, Renee. So you could, even if you're an at-will employee, you can have the right to severance. That doesn't stop you from being an at-will employee. It just gives you a contractual obligation severance if you are terminated under certain circumstances. And those could be contained in your offer letter. It could be contained in an employment contract, or it could be contained in an employee policy, a severance policy that the company has. If you have an offer letter or you have a contract, then that's a binding commitment and it doesn't change unless it's allowed to change in that agreement or you agree to change it. If you are simply subject to the company's policy, then as I said, that could change and you're not assured. And the only thing that keeps you assured is that company likes to keep its employees and wants to keep them happy. And if it unilaterally just starts taking away things that everyone thinks they have, well, that's probably not going to be a good long-term strategy for success. So companies are reluctant to eliminate benefits, but I can promise you that if the company's being sold and they have a severance policy and realize that, wait a minute, we're being bought by someone, they're going to hire all our people, we don't want to pay severance to them as well. They can amend their policy to say that's not a termination and isn't subject to severance. And guess what? If that's done before the actual transaction, you're not getting severance. So I hope that answers your question. If not, repose it. So here are the components that we tend to see. You have the base salary and bonus arrangements. We have equity compensation, which might be in the form of actual stock or equity or membership units if it's a partnership or an LLC. Might be in some other equity-like type thing, and we'll talk a little bit about that. We have non-equity benefits. These are generally long-term bonus type programs or other things of that nature. We have health and welfare benefits, and then we have perquisites, which are not a thing of the past, but clearly not like they used to be. And we'll talk more about that. Let's move on to the next one. So non-competes and other provisions. The restrictive covenants are one of the things that you need to pay attention to, not only at your present job, if you have any, but if you look at another job, what they're going to require you to do, because the non-competition agreements, the non-solicitations, the non-disparagements, and the confidentiality and other kinds of restrictions can be incredibly burdensome. If you're not familiar with them, two things can happen. One is you could unintentionally be in violation of them, and two, you could be eliminated from being able to do a lot of things that you think you want to do afterwards, or be put in a position where you're really not all that employable because there's so many things you are not allowed to do because of those contracts. So I would say I spent a good portion of my time when I'm representing an executive that's looking at a contract, trying to understand, what are these limitations? Are they fair and reasonable? Do they really protect the interests of the company, or are they overburdensome on the employee? Are there ways to revise them to make them more understandable to the employee? Because, it's one thing to agree to not compete, and another thing to sign an agreement and find out afterwards, well, wait a minute, I'm not even sure what that means. Can I take this job, which is not in the same industry, but has a small little division that, does some of this, and not understand all the rules, because it's hard enough to find a new job if you aren't sure whether or not you can take it and whether or not it's going to be competitive. And you have to go through a process to try and figure that out, or worse, take it and find out from your old employer that, wait a minute, we believe that's a violation of your restrictive covenant. Not only are we cutting off your severance and cutting off your other benefits, but we're going to sue you if you don't leave. That's troublesome. So very important to make sure you understand these, and that to the extent that you have the leverage, you negotiate them to be fair, reasonable, and not overly burdensome on you. And so we deal with a lot of companies, and this is, as I said, this is often the most significant concern to people, these non-compete, non-solicitation provisions in particular, because they just don't know what they don't know what is even going to say when it's time to leave, because it's a moving target. Who knows? I know what we do now, but I take this job and 4 years from now, I don't know what they're going to do. I don't know what divisions they're going to buy. I don't know what role I'm going to have. So this could be a much broader restriction. So keep that in mind.
And the only comment I want to make on this, John, is if you're entering into retirement and potentially an encore career, don't forget the fact that these will still apply. And so it's really critical, for example, if you're leaving the ranks of a Fortune 500 company as a high-level executive and potentially going to do some consulting work, you need to make sure you're abiding by any non-compete agreements that you have in place, even post-retirement. So don't be lulled into this sense that, oh, now that I've retired, I've kind of got to clear road ahead of me. This applies even in retirement.
That's a great point. And, just be cognizant of what your restrictions are. The non-disparagement, I would just simply tell you, I don't like non-disparagement. I mean, it doesn't have any kind of excuse for truth or for just a general complaint or anything like that. I mean, non-disparagement means simply not saying anything bad about anybody. And it's kind of hard to do. Now, I strongly recommend to everyone on this call or on this webinar, do not burn any bridges when you leave a company. Don't start disparaging. It's a bad idea, no matter how dissatisfied or angry you are. It's just, it's a small world. It will come back. It will be heard. People, will see it. So don't do it anyway. But if you have a non-disparagement provision, recognize that you could be in breach of an agreement if you do that. And then lastly, the confidentiality restrictions. Again, a lot of times these can be overly broad, but most states have protections of confidential and information like that anyway. So for the most part, that's pretty much what they can restrict. So I guess the answer is, if it belongs to the company, if it's a trade secret, if it is a customer list, be careful about making sure that you don't start copying things and taking things right before you leave. Most companies can do some computer search and figure out exactly what you downloaded, make a list of everything you downloaded. And when they go into court, that's a heck of a nice piece of evidence to show, Your Honor, they went to a competing job, and right before they left, they downloaded our customer list, they downloaded our pricing list. That is going to get you in a lot of trouble. Okay, let's move on to the next one. So base salary and bonus, I think these are the one that everyone understands the most. And I'll be honest, for the most part, this is not why people leave or take a job or leave a job. It's certainly important. It's always feels good to have a nice base and a nice bonus opportunity, and you want to make sure that that base can't be decreased. You don't want to get an offer to come, and then the next year it's cut by 20%. Well, you didn't achieve what we thought you would. You want to make sure you have some confidence that it's only going one way, which is up. And the bonus arrangements, obviously, this is the very important to companies to have clear and well written and bonus agreements that set forth all the goals and incentives and properly motivate you to do what you need to do in order for the company to be successful, and you'll be successful. So very important. I will tell you that we don't tend to do a lot of negotiation of base and bonus. Those are usually best negotiated by you. You're in the best position. This is a business agreement. And for the most part, you're the ones that can do the best job of that. Now, we have all sorts of information that we can bring to you about, well, this is the mid-range of what we see for a company about that size, or this is anecdotally what we would expect, or this seems to be in the right range. But for the most part, you're going to be able to do that. The other thing I will tell you is that in many jurisdictions now, it is not legal for them to ask you what you're earning, because it perpetuates discrimination. So if you are a minority woman who has been underpaid, if you have to disclose what you've been earning, then that will obviously perpetuate their ability to underpay you, because heck, why not? So, they can ask you what you're looking for or what you expect, the range of that, but they can't ask you in those jurisdictions what you actually are earning.
I just wanted to pipe in real quick. I'd love to ask the group a question, if you would answer us in the chat. I'm curious how many people in this group had the foresight or comfort level to negotiate their starting salary on their first official job or career, I guess I should say. I know I, for one, did not. I must admit that. I was just super excited that I was going to get a job in a big accounting firm, and I was pumped. And I took that, I think it was either $23,000 or $28,000 a year that they offered me, and didn't even think about it twice. Now, interestingly enough, I think there's a tendency that men will often negotiate for themselves better than women. I hope we're changing that, but I'm not going to shame myself for not making the decision to negotiate, but I'd love to hear from you if any of you did. It's interesting if you look at the numbers. If you were able to negotiate just 5,000 more in base salary at the age of 29, say when you got your first or second job, and you worked until age 65 with just 2.5% increases, that would have created an additional $300,000 of wealth. And that's not accounting for investment gains or anything else. So it can never hurt, particularly if you've done your research and your homework and you know what base salaries should look like. Ask for more if you don't think that they're in a reasonable range. And if you start early enough, it can be really meaningful for you in the long term.
And Emily, I could not agree with you more, with one caveat, which I don't think is something you didn't say, but just one caveat, which is get all your ducks in a row before you start asking. In other words, the last thing you want to do is go back, I need more money. Okay, now I'd like to better change this provision. Oh, now I've read it. You don't want to be that person. But I've been involved in, I don't know, maybe 1,000 employment contracts over my career. And I can count on one finger the number of times where someone went back and they took away the job offer. As long as you're reasonable and professional, but they're hiring you as a business person. So they would, I think they would look down on you if you didn't act professionally and come back and ask questions and ask for items that you want. Now, I work fully under the theory of pigs get fed and hogs get slaughtered. So figure out what's really important, prioritize those items, figure out based on your leverage how much you can really ask for, and put your list together and be prepared to compromise on some of them. But yeah, definitely go back if you think you need to.
Well, and so John, in the chat, I noticed there's a mixed bag. There are people that had the confidence to negotiate. I think Ebony shared that in for-profit, she was a lot more comfortable negotiating than in non-for-profit type roles, which I understand. Others said, like me, we didn't negotiate, but that doesn't mean it's too late. You can always start to negotiate for yourself at any time. And then some people just started early, and that's pretty awesome. While we're on that topic of negotiating as it relates to bases and bonuses, just a couple nuances here on the bonuses. There's signing bonuses. There's just the typical incentive bonus that hopefully you get every year, and it makes total sense how it's calculated. And then there's also things like retention bonuses. And I love to share stories because I think it makes things relatable. So I want to share a story about an actual situation with someone that we work with. And it was someone who was negotiating into a position. She was working in a Fortune 500 company, super successful, high-level financial professional. So very versed on finances, but a little tepid on negotiating for herself. So she did the right thing. She reached out to her advisory teams. She got us involved. She got some attorneys involved, and she was ready to roll. And something that we noticed is that she was losing a lot of grants in her old company, and they were getting ready to vest. So she was walking away from compensation that would have been hers within about a 6-month period of time. The new company recognized that, but offered her what would arguably be kind of like a retention grant. They were giving her a 3-year cliff vesting restricted share to replace the things she was walking away from that were going to vest and be hers in 6 months. Well, we just said, gosh, understand this nuance here, that you're now essentially extending for 2.5 more years. And what if they decide at some point they don't love you anymore, and they decide that you're not going to work for them anymore? And she said, oh, wow, well, I don't know if they'll change this, but it's worth asking. And I'll just flip the email that you sent me to the gentleman I'm negotiating with in HR and see what he does about it. And so lo and behold, she forwarded the message to him, and he did agree to set up her grant such that, yes, it's still cliff vested in 3 years, but if she left the company for any reason, because they just decided they didn't love her anymore, it wasn't terminated for cause because she did something bad. It wasn't, I quit because I don't like it anymore. But he was able to set the provisions such that she would take it with her if she left. And it did happen. Within about a year, she realized she did not see eye to eye with the CEO, and he asked her to leave, and she kept that restricted share vest. It is going to vest in May of 2022. So here in a couple of months, and she's about it's between $700,000 and $900,000. You've seen the market; it's pretty volatile right now. But about $700,000 to $900,000 of additional compensation that, had she even just not asked the question, she would not have. So it's worth asking, and sometimes leaning on that advisory team and saying, "Hey, my team of advisors suggested I ask this question." It makes you feel a little bit better about doing these things.
Right. And there are a lot of great examples like that, Emily. So thanks for sharing that. The fact is, you never know exactly what is the right thing to ask for in your situation. Each person's different. Each situation is different. And so that's why I'm saying go through everything, figure out all the potential wants, prioritize them, and figure out just how aggressive do you want to get. As I said, if you're professional, if you're positive, if you're, hey, I'm really excited about this, we just got to work out some things. I've yet to see a company, with one exception, and that there was a good reason we found out afterwards for that exception, had nothing to do with asking, where they've basically didn't took the job offer away. Now I've seen situations where they said basically we can't do any more. This is the best we can do. Take it or leave it. And then guess what? You take it or leave it. But it generally does not hurt to go back with a few things. And I'll give you a couple examples. I represent one executive who's been an incredibly successful CEO at what has become hugely large companies. And when he gets an offer, we have a list of about 45 things that we put in, we got to change this. We want these 5 provisions in there. We want more incentive. This is what we want. We want it, we're all, ranging it so that from a tax standpoint, it makes the most sense and he's protected. And, if they come back and say, well, we can't do that, this guy has the leverage to say, well, that's been fun. I'm really glad we talked. I really wish you luck. And he means it. And every single time they've come back and say, well, let's figure out if we can't figure out a solution. And sure enough, they do. Whereas I've also negotiated contracts for my son, who doesn't have that kind of leverage, although he's slowly building it, doesn't have that kind of leverage. And we've gone back and asked for 2 minor things. One of them was an acceleration of his equity incentive if he was terminated by the company for other than cause. And the other one was, a basic severance benefit that kicked in. And sure enough, those came back and were very valuable to him, unfortunately, when they had to let him go, at his one position. So the point I'm saying is, wherever you stand, there's got to be a few things you can do and add that could be very beneficial or provide you with a lot of protection, or maybe even make it so that when it comes time we have to let someone go, and they look at, well, wait a minute, if we let her go, we gotta give her this, and that. Why don't we let somebody else go? There are times where it can save your job. So let's move on to the next slide, if we can. So equity compensation, and let's be honest, equity compensation, and it's inclusive of both equity and things that look like equity, tend to, these long-term incentive type programs that are motivated to make you think like a shareholder and to make decisions that are in the long-term best interest of the company. This is where the real money is made. This is where the long-term financial success is generally driven by. Salary's great, bonuses are great, don't get me wrong, but the real wealth is, that is derived from working has generally come from long-term incentives. So don't underestimate the value of this. And there's no time like when you start to negotiate for these things. It's a lot harder once you're working there to go in and say, I really think I deserve some, more options. It's the best time to do that is when you start. And it's not only the number, it's the type. Each type of plan, and there are literally dozens of different, permeations of long-term incentive and equity type programs. Each has a little bit different, method of determining its value as well as the tax consequence. And 5% of the company in stock options is not the same as 5% of the company in incentive stock options. And it's not the same as 5% of the company in restricted stock or in restricted stock units. They all have different attributes, not only in how you figure out what the true value is, but also in what the tax impact is and how they might impact you down the road. So, this is where we spend quite a bit of time making sure we understand how they work and whether they are sensible and whether they protect you. And don't underestimate the value of that. Okay, let's move on to the next one. Retirement plans. Now, this generally is not a negotiated term. In other words, retirement plans by their nature are subject to ERISA and all sorts of discrimination rules. And so for the most part, the qualified retirement plans are what they are. Now, it's important for you to understand them for several things. One is if you're comparing an old job with a new job, you want to be able to place some value on what you're leaving versus what you're getting when it comes to the retirement plans. But also you want to make sure that you understand the plans and you take advantage of it. So if there is a matching contribution that is up to 6%, you want to know that because it would be senseless to make a 3% contribution in that case and give up the match potentially. So you need to understand that. The non-qualified deferred comps are not subject to these rules. And by definition, they're only available to the highly compensated employees and officers of the company. And those are the ones that, because they're not subject to ERISA, and the reason why they're not subject to ERISA is simply because you have to be what's called a top hat employee generally. You have to be, a higher exec to be able to participate in those. And the Department of Labor and Congress felt that those people could negotiate on their own behalf and didn't need the protections that ERISA provides to the rank and file employees. So they're not subject to ERISA, and the reason why they're not is because they're limited to the top group of people. And again, those can be very individualistic because they don't have the general rules. And so if you are participating in that, if they have a plan that's available to you, you ought to understand it. You're probably not going to get them to negotiate the difference, but maybe they will. Maybe they'll credit you with some prior service for vesting, or maybe they will credit you with prior service if there's some sort of service-weighted contribution provision in it. But these are things you need to understand, again, if for no other reason to value this opportunity versus the one you're leaving. I don't know if there are any questions. Okay.
I'm not seeing any questions in the chat, John, but a couple comments. I want to share something that Jillian shared with us.
Please.
Jillian mentors a lot of master's degree students who are negotiating for their first jobs, and she tells them to ask as many questions as they can to understand how the employer arrived at the salary, then go back, think about it, use that information to negotiate. And, Jillian's living by the old Patty Fry adage, Patty's my mom, which is knowledge is power. And to your earlier point, John, really making sure that you understand before you step into a negotiation, what are they offering you? How does that compare? What is it that you're offering to them that, gives you cause to say, hey, I should be in a higher section of that salary range? Having that kind of knowledge and be able to negotiate from that position of power, I think is going to be a lot more beneficial for you, and actually will come across as a lot more authentic.
That's a great point. That's a great point. There are a lot of surveys out there that do nothing other than try and gauge the value of each position. And some of them are available publicly, or if you're nice to someone who has access to them, you might be able to get some information. But Absolutely. The more information you have about what others are receiving for doing what you're doing, or the more information you have about what that company is paying other people in similar positions,
Yeah.
fantastic. Now, if it's publicly traded, there may be, and you're at a high level, then there may be actual information that's available right online through looking at proxies. But those tend to be only the very top jobs. And so if you're looking below that, you're going to have to look at a survey. You're going to have to get, proprietary information probably.
And John, I don't know, I must be trying to encourage people to retire, but I want to share just 2 retirement nuances that, as it relates to your 2 recent topics, equity comp and retirement plans. John mentioned a really important point, which is not all of these plans are treated equally for tax purposes, and you can even run into challenges as you look to retire. So going back to that equity incentive compensation, incentive stock options are a great type of options to have. They get some beneficial tax treatment, but that tax treatment goes away within 90 days after you leave a company. So you only have 90 days to exercise options while they're still ISOs, and otherwise they convert to non-qualified. Worse yet, not all companies allow you to keep your even vested options if you've not met all the full retirement age requirements. Every company's looks a little different. It could be age 65, it could be 55 plus 10 years of service, any range of things, but you really want to understand, what is my company's definition of full retirement? And if I don't meet that, what happens to my options, to my restricted shares? Do they continue to vest or not? If they stop vesting, do I get to keep them? We did have a situation, actually more than one situation, dodged bullets in both cases, but where the person had not reached the full retirement age and was leaving the company and could have lost all of their options had they made the decision to leave before exercising. So just read the fine print. That's what your advisory team is for. Have them read the fine print and really understand how these plans work, because not all are created equally. And the one last comment on retirement as it relates to retirement plans is John talked about these 2 different types of plan, the qualified or ERISA covered plans and the non-qualified. Not that they're necessarily a lot of leverage for negotiation, but John, thank you for that vesting comment. I hadn't even really thought about that, but they're treated very differently for tax purposes. When you leave a company, a qualified retirement plan is rollover eligible and you can continue to get beneficial deferred tax treatment on them. Non-qualified deferred comp plans, non-qualified type SERPs, they may pay out all in one big lump sum, and if they do, they're all taxed at that time. So just keep in mind that there's some nuances to these types of investments and how they're taxed, and it could make a big difference. And you don't want to be surprised.
That's a great point, Emily. I would just simply say it this way. Whether you hold options, restricted stock, or some other long-term equity, whether you're participating in a qualified plan or non-qualified plan, or whether you have any other incentive or other thing out there, it really pays for you to plan ahead. So long before you think about retiring, you need to sit down with Emily and her group, or with a noted professional or whatever, and start going through what your alternatives are and how to best take advantage of them. It very well may be to exercise your options earlier so that you're holding them, well before you retire. It may be, just a plan as to, okay, this is what we're going to do with this group. We're going to do it for this one. We're going to wait. Whatever it is, it makes sense for it to be purposeful, because how you do that will impact the ultimate taxation. Let's move on, unless you have something, Emily.
We're going to jump to the next, but I have a question here from Nancy that relates to equity. So I think this is a good time to answer it. What about a company that is thinking about going public? And can you get some parameters for when it goes public, how to get some equity, or how that equity is handled? And Nancy, that is such a great question, because non-publicly traded equity can have some significant nuances to it. So I'd love for John to speak a little bit to that.
So first of all, I mean, companies rarely go public, and believe me, that's when you want to have equity. You want to have it long before they go public, or at least you want to have it issued to you at a price before it goes public, because generally the public market, the whole process of going through an IPO and then being traded tends to create, a lot of upside for the stock. And if you get it afterwards, it's either going to be costly from you from a tax standpoint, or you're only getting the appreciation from then on. So in either circumstance, try to get it before. I'm sure the company will have some holding periods and things, tie-up periods and so forth, in which you're not allowed to trade your stock that you get. In other words, if they give you options or they give you restricted stock and they go public, they're going to tie you down for at least 180 days after that, so that you're not trading and changing the market. But yeah, absolutely, if you think your company has any chance of going public, this is the time to start asking for more. Whether they'll give it or not depends. There's this concept called overhang, which is the amount of stock they have out there committed to their executives and so forth. And companies don't want to have too much of that. But by the same token, it's a currency that they have plenty of stock, and it's a very valuable currency, and probably more valuable to them than cash. So yeah, this is the time to ask for it. We're moving on to the health and well-being, and if I didn't answer your question completely, again, for the most part, health and the health and welfare benefit type programs are what they are. I mean, the days of having a lot of executive type programs when it comes to health and welfare are pretty much gone. You may have some death benefit rights or life insurance type rights, but even the split dollar type of things that we used to see regularly, they don't tend to be. So these tend to be across the board for the company, and you just participate based on how you participate. And there are discrimination and other limitations and rules like that apply, that make it so that you can't do too much individually for yourself. That having been said, two concepts that you should be aware of. One is that it's, not every health insurance, life insurance, disability insurance, and paid time off policy is the same. And some are a great deal more generous, or the cost to you is a great deal less, or your out of pocket or deductibles or whatever are less, or the definition of a disability and how long you have to, and when it shifts to something else. A lot of times disability is you can't do your job, but then after a year, it's you can't do any job. So that's not nearly as a good of a policy. If it's forever, a lifetime, you can't do your job, because after a year they may come and say, well, you could probably man the parking lot over at the airport, because just sitting in a chair and pressing buttons, you could do that. So we're taking off a disability. So anyway, the point I'm saying is factor it in, make sure that you're comfortable with the way it works, and that you've properly have identified its value versus what you're leaving. Recognize the concept of COBRA, which is the ability to continue to participate in your prior plan for up to 18 months, in some cases longer if there's a disability, at your cost, and your full cost. In fact, 102% of the full cost. But at least that's an option if you get terminated and you don't have a better coverage, you don't want to go bare. So just keep all that in mind and take a look at it, make sure you understand it and factor it into its value.
Yeah, and I would just say, John's come back to that common theme of knowledge is power. It's not like you have a lot of leverage to change many of these things here, but just knowing when you walk in how it works, you'll never look back and say, oh, darn, I wish I would have asked that question. And, things like maternity and paternity leave. Gosh, when I started at Fairport Wealth, we had a good policy, but it's gotten even better. And now our fathers even get 6+ weeks of paid time off for paternity leave. So ask the question, understand how it works. Even if you can't change it, you want to know how it works, so you're never kicking yourself in the rear view mirror.
Great point. Let's move to the next slide. So perks, this used to be a big part of my job. You look at every proxy of a publicly traded company, and there'd be a list of the different things that they provide to their executives. Well, they changed the rules of how public traded companies have to report, and now the value that you got for allowing your spouse to be on the private airplane, or the value you got for a first class upgrade now shows up as an actual dollar value that you're earning. And so most of my clients have now said, just pay me more. You know, I'll buy my own ticket, just pay me more. I don't want it showing up like that. But nonetheless, perks are important. So I know, Emily, you probably deal with this a lot more than I do even.
Yeah, we see a lot with perks. And what's interesting is now from a tax perspective, since 2017 tax law changes, employee business expenses are no longer deductible. If you're employed by a company, that would have been a Schedule A expense. You could have deducted it with lots of limitations. These days, it's not even deductible. But there are some expense reimbursements and things that you receive and you can receive without being taxed on them. To John's earlier point, certainly things like car allowances you are taxed on. But a couple of examples, things that you can be looking for, just say for argument's sake, you have accreditations as a part of your job. For one, I have to keep my CPA license up and my AEP license up and my PFS license up. Well, in order to do that, I have a lot of continuing education credit that I have to receive. Understanding, does the company offer to help you with those accreditations and paying the associated fees and or the continuing education that you have to receive in order to meet your requirements? That is them paying an expense on your behalf, and it's not taxed to you. And so it is a real big benefit because it's getting rid of expenses that you would have otherwise had. Them paying for your cell phone usage or automobile allowances. One that's really become a big deal in the last 2 years, as we all know, is your company willing to help you with a really strong office setup to support what you're trying to accomplish? That may mean anything from just having a really good computer to 2 monitors because you got to be reviewing the tax return on one screen and the source documents on the other. It could be that if you're in a role that's marketing related and you're having to do videos or put together big pamphlets, that you need a Mac and you don't really want that, that other computer. So really get an understanding of how your company will support you in being successful in your role, knowing that a lot of us are spending time both working from home and from the office. These are really important questions to ask. Easy for a company to adjust the way they approach them too. So it makes them good negotiating points. And it's like icing on top of the cherry on top of the cake. It's giving you some additional help. And a company is willing to give that because they don't necessarily have to justify it in salary bands or things like that. So just keep that one in mind. Next is a little bit more. We're talking about these, what I would call non-monetary features. Wonderful perks. We don't see them in a lot of companies, but provision of daycare. As I mentioned before, automobile allowances, taxable, but still a huge benefit. But a big one is flexible hours. These days, a lot of us are looking at work-life balance. Heck, can I take my child to the doctor during the day and not have to worry about taking PTO? So understanding the company's viewpoint on in-office hours versus out-of-office hours, flexible time, ability to take appointments during the day. It's really important because at the end of the day, it might not get you to go into a job, but I'll tell you, if you get to a job and you realize it's highly inflexible and it doesn't work within your lifestyle, you'll be kicking yourself all day long. So just ask the question and understand how the company's culture works as it relates to these types of perks.
So many jobs now are being done online, out remotely. My wife is an executive recruiter, and I can't tell you how many times she will talk with a candidate who won't even consider taking a job where they have to report at the company on any kind of regular basis, that they can't do it remotely. And there's a ton of reasons for why that might make sense. But the fact is, if that's important to you, then make sure that, the job you're looking at gives you the ability to do what you need to do or want to do, or factored into your consideration.
Next slide, please. Really, the only thing I want to hit on here, is company culture. Obviously, there's some travel involved in some jobs, although not so much these days. Ask the question and understand those things. But company culture, to John's earlier point, I think he said one of the biggest reasons people leave a company is because they're unhappy with the boss. I think probably people leaving bad company culture is a big driver too. And so how can you really get your head around, does this culture align with me? I think probably one of the best ways to do that is to get a strong understanding of your core values as a person and get a strong understanding of the core values of the company and make sure that they are in alignment. Because if they're not, more than likely, you will feel just some underlying discomfort within that company culture. And the other advice I would give is just talk to as many people as you can at various levels, whether it's talking with, people who might be your peers within the company, obviously people that you would be working directly for or that would be working directly for you. Maybe in a more casual setting, have a lunch, get people to get comfortable and share with you and really listen to what they have to say. You may want to jump on the company's website, take a look at where they put a lot of their emphasis. What might their values be? Do they do a lot of work within the community? All these things that might align well with you or not so well with you. You can probably get a good taste of that on their website, on their social media. So I think that's a great way to really get an understanding of the company culture, because that's a big driver of people getting upset and leaving.
That's worth pointing out. Every law firm thinks it's a really cool place to work and has a great company culture, and everyone knows the right buzzwords. But so when you go into interview at a law firm, you're going to hear all the same thing. Oh, we're collegial, we work together, blah, 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 blah. You've got to open your eyes and just look around and see how people actually deal with one another. How formal are they? Are there open doors? Are people, collaborating, things like that? That's going to tell you as much about company culture as anyone's going to tell you who's trying to recruit you. The other thing, and Emily is absolutely right, if you go out to lunch or dinner with some of the employees, pay attention to what they're doing and ask the right questions and try and figure out whether it's real or whether it's just a facade. Because if it's a lousy company culture, you're really not going to enjoy your job no matter how much you're making. Okay.
Next slide, please. All right, negotiate an offer that works for you. We can hop to the next slide, Annika. We love this quote. Actually, one of our attendees of our programs shared this with us. She said, we teach other people how to treat us. And I thought that was really profound and meaningful, that, we can drive how we end up in this process just with the way we approach it, with our knowledge that we come in with our real true alignment with our values and our authenticity. So just remember, we teach other people how to treat us. Next slide, please. So this is where we talk about the, icky stuff, severance sometimes, and then the, delightful stuff, happy retirement. I do have a question, John, I'm going to set you up with so you can be thinking about it as we talk through this slide. Renee had a follow-up question to her earlier severance question, which is, does a company have to make it public to its employees when they change their policies, for example, around severance, as you mentioned, they might do earlier? And so let's jump into these severance discussions.
Okay, well, severance is such a critical issue, particularly if you're going to have restrictive covenants that stop you from being able to take certain opportunities that might be the most obvious opportunities. So it's something we negotiate in virtually every contract that we deal with. Obviously, for those that are lower in the echelon, they may not have the leverage to ask for severance or get it. But it's something I almost always ask for. And even if it's just a few months, just understanding, maybe it's a little bit different nowadays, but understanding that the higher you are, the harder it is to get a comparable good job. And it used to be a month per I think $10,000. Obviously, that is not true anymore. But the point being, negotiate your severance up front. It does two things. One, it gives you a little bit of a leg to stand on if in fact you are terminated. to be able to have some funds available to you for some period of time so that you're not having to dig immediately into your savings. And two, it does give them a little pause to terminate you for other than, obvious reason. And so there's no reason not to ask for it. The concepts here of golden parachute, that's a concept that I hope that you all have. It's if there's a change of control, there's a rule out there that basically says that if you receive more compensation, it's contingent on that change, then equal to or more than 3 times your average comp over the prior 5 years, you have an issue. Now, we generally can work around that issue, and it's not a terrible issue to have, although it can be very costly. But we all want golden parachutes, so don't be afraid about that. COBRA, if you're in a health plan, when you terminate, unless you have been terminated for egregious cause, and there's a case out there that's where someone was stealing frozen turkeys off the back of the truck, they terminated him, didn't said that was misconduct and wasn't eligible for COBRA, and the court came back and said, well, that's not that bad. So the point being, it's pretty rare not to be eligible for COBRA, but you have to work for a company that has at least 20 employees in order for that to be the case. The executive coach or outplacement, so there's 2 things. One is you may want an executive coach while you're there, and that might be something to ask for, particularly if you're taking on new roles in management or things of that nature that you're not familiar with, and you want to make sure that you're being sensitive to the needs of your staff and yet still doing a good job managing. You can ask for that. But the other thing is you might want outplacement when you leave, and that's the ability to help you figure out how to get your resume together, how to deal with all that. And that would be part of the severance package that you might ask for. Accrued paid time off, again, that's something that we can ask for. Most companies have a policy that either says that when you leave, you get your accrued but unused paid time off, or you don't. It's different in every state as to whether or not they have to. But for the most part, it'll be in their employee handbook as to what they do. And you can certainly ask that. Although I would tell you, I wouldn't focus too much on that until after you're hired, because no one wants to hear you talking too much about what do I get when I leave. So just be a little bit careful. And then we talked a little briefly about the equity compensation forfeiture, and that's simply a question of under what circumstances would my long-term incentive or bonuses or equity or whatever, would that potentially accelerate the vesting if certain things happen, such as you terminate me and it's not for cause, or I leave for good reason, or there's a change in control. Those are all things that we can put into an agreement that would benefit you potentially if one of those events occurred. And so those are the subject of negotiation. Next.
All right, and I'm gonna repeat a question here that Melissa put in the chat, John. She's asking if there are special tax consequences if your severance gets you to a position that acts like a golden parachute, multiples of prior year income. Is there extra tax on that, or only in the change of control instances?
So it's only in a change of control. So the good news is, and usually that's when it gets, really accelerated, because now all of a sudden all your stock has been bought out and accelerated and things of that nature. If it's under normal circumstances, if the company agreed to pay you a bonus of $5 million, if you hit these following 3 things and you hit those following 3 things, then you're going to get their $5 million, and there are limitations and things like that for the company on a tax standpoint, but they don't impact you. They impact the ability of the company to deduct that. But for the most part, the golden parachute is only applicable when there is a change in control. And if that's the case, again, depending on whether you're public or not, there's a process that we go through, including in some cases, we value your non-compete and treat that as not being paid to you. It's being paid to you for not rendering services to a competitor afterwards, rather than as a result of the change in control. There are all sorts of little tricks we have, but it's a problem that I hope you all have and get to work around.
I love it. Well, just jumping into, one slide's not going to do it justice, but we talked a lot about the non-monetary and the monetary features. We talked about contractual obligations, But there is an art to negotiation, as we probably all figured out based on just the commentary in the chat. Some of us feel more comfortable than others. Some of us feel more comfortable in different situations. So how do you take on that art of negotiation and use it to your advantage? Let me first say that, again, we could do a whole session on this, but there's some great resources out there. There's a good friend of our firm that's done some speaking for Hightower Advisors, our parent company. Her name's Kathleen Kingsbury, and she has a wonderful website. It's called Breaking the Money Silence. On that website, she's got some podcasts, many of which are focused on more of the art of negotiation. If you want the numbers, follow up with us and I can give you the podcast numbers, but I'll rattle them off to you right now. 127, 28, and 29, 132, 33, and 39. All really good podcasts. I've listened to them as it relates to different aspects of the art of negotiation. And a big theme for Kathleen is around what are those money messages that were ingrained in you as a young person that could be limiting beliefs in how you negotiate for yourself? It's funny, she shared a stat that 44% of Americans would rather talk about death or politics than negotiate for themselves. I'm like, aren't those the two topics that everybody avoids? So it must be really bad. But at the end of the day, I think if you really have a comfort level with your values, and you're negotiating from a place of authenticity, and you've overcome maybe some of those money blocks that you can have a really good, artful negotiation. People worry sometimes, if I negotiate, will I look greedy? Will I look annoying? Will I look selfish? You've got to remember that balance of what you're bringing to the company, which justifies these additional things that you're asking for, or what you're giving up, which justifies these additional things that you're asking for. We shared a link here in the presentation. If you say to yourself, well, Emily's talked a few times about really understanding my core values and aligning them with the company, but I'm not really 100% sure where they are at. Found a really cool website that's shared here that takes you through this electronic process of elimination, identification of your core values. I personally loved it because I've always struggled with honing in on those. So that could be a great way. And then, of course, there's always the practice, you know, sit in front of the mirror, sit in front of a friend or a colleague, one of those people on your team of advisors, and share some of these asks and see how they react and respond. You know, that's the art of negotiation in a hot 3 minutes. And like I said, we've got some great resources we'd love to share with you afterwards if you want to learn a little bit more about the artful side of this as well.
Yeah, and I would just reiterate the advice that we already gave, which is, first of all, do your homework, understand what your issues are, prioritize them, be reasonable and sensible. No, you know, don't be in that, you know, don't get unprofessional, don't get overreaching. Understand what's appropriate, and then have the confidence to go in there and say, hey, I've looked at this. There's a few items I'd like to talk to you about that would make this a lot easier for me, and see what you can get.
And Annika, you can jump to the last slide, which is, we're just telling you what we told you. We're reiterating really key factors as you're transitioning in your career at any stage. Build an advisory team, a group of people that can help you compare what you have versus what you're going to get. And do not forget those non-monetary features as you're reviewing the package. And then negotiate an offer that works for you in a way that feels right and authentic to you. And with that, I think we've wrapped the presentation. I'd love if anyone else wants to share questions. Thank you all. You've been so engaged throughout the whole presentation. We appreciate everything you've shared in the chat. At this point, if you have questions and just want to unmute and shout them out, I'm all about that. Please do, so that I'm not having to read.
Thank you, everyone.
So I'm going to give you all some time to see if you have any questions. I'll offer one more thing, which is we will follow up and provide you all with a replay. And again, if there's any resources that we can provide to you to be helpful, we would love to do that.
Hey, I'm just going to respond to Melissa. I don't know if you're still on, but hi, how are you? Nice to for you to join us. I didn't fully answer your question. Oh, good. I didn't fully answer your question. There is an excise tax on the employee if in fact they end up getting a parachute payment upon a change of control. It's 20% of the value of the payment that's deemed to be a parachute payment above 1 times their average comp. So that can get very costly. So there's all sorts of tricks and provisions that we tend to put in place to try to avoid that. Because believe it or not, that excise tax, when you add it to regular taxes and so forth, means that you could, if you got 2.99 times your average, you're fine. If you get anywhere from 3 to all the way up to about 4.3 or 4.4 times your average, you would actually be better off just staying at the 2.99. And after paying that excise tax and paying regular tax on the additional, you would actually net more at 2.99. So there's a whole math that goes into all that. But I do think if you have questions, let me know.
Oh, so
I will do
Annika,
so.
can you flip to the next slide? And Herman, I'm sure there's a first name, so I'm sorry I'm calling you Herman. This was a fabulous session. John, do you have a website or books or any upcoming presentations or anything else that you can share?
And I don't know Herman's first name, so I apologize, Mr. and Miss Herman. But the answer is you can go to our website at McDonald Hopkins. We do a lot of posting of presentations and so forth, or you can reach out to me and I'll be happy to let you know. Oh, Maria, Maria, sorry about that.
Oh, it's Maria Hernandez.
I'll be happy to let you know.
Is her name.
I'll be
Yes.
happy to let you know what's going on. So thank you.
Good. Thank you so much for showing up, everyone. We appreciate. Please do reach out if you have any other questions. We'd love to chat with you. And I think we can close the presentation and you know where to find us.
Thank you. Have a nice evening, everyone. And thank you, Emily. Bye-bye now.
Thanks, John.